I'm also professor of finance at the City University of New York. I'll be moderating today's webinar. The format will be as follows. We will start with a conversation with our guest, with a few questions from me, and then we'll follow up with questions from the audience. So please submit your questions using the chat feature. In the meantime, please mute your microphones, and please also know that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available later for wider audience. Today's webinar will focus on issues related to the state of science and education in Armenia and the future of these fields. Our guest today is Professor Areg Danagoulian. He received his PhD in experimental nuclear physics from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He later worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory as a postdoctoral researcher, and then as a senior scientist at Passport Systems. Areg Danagoulian is currently Associate Professor of Nuclear Science and Engineering at MIT. His current research interests focus on nuclear physics applications in nuclear security, such as nuclear non-proliferation, technologies for treaty verification, nuclear safeguards, and cargo security. Welcome, Areg.
Right. Thank you, Armen. Thank you for the introduction.
All right. So I wanted to start our conversation with a talk about funding of science. All right. We all know money is not everything, but serious science requires research infrastructure, which is expensive to acquire and maintain, and therefore money turns out to be quite important. Now, to understand the situation with funding of science in Armenia, we need some context and points of reference, and for that, I'm going to show everyone a diagram first, sort of to motivate our conversation. Let me share this. There we go. So this is a diagram from, hold on, what happened? Okay, from UNESCO website. All right, it's sort of three-dimensional diagram. On the horizontal axis, we have R&D, research and development expenditures as percentage of GDP. On vertical axis, we have number of researchers per million of residents. And then each country is represented by a circle. And the size of the circle reflects the absolute amount of funding spent on research and development. So the biggest circle is United States. The second biggest is China, and so on. All right. In relative terms, Korea, South Korea, is the one with the highest spending on research and development. Okay, someone says they cannot see the screen. Can everyone see the screen?
I can definitely see the screen.
All right. You can, right?
Yes.
Okay. So the one country is missing here, also kind of important. It's Israel. For some reason, UNESCO doesn't have a number of researchers in Israel. But if you look at the R&D spending as percentage of GDP, it's 4.2%. So they will be somewhere next to South Korea. Right? Now, Armenia would be somewhere on the left side over here. And we cannot see it, but I can sort of click on a drop-down menu. And here's Armenia. So Armenia spends 0.2% of its GDP on research and development. And in dollar amounts, this is about $59 million. All right. So 0.2% of GDP, $59 million, equivalent of $59 million. This is in what they call purchasing power parity. In other words, they take into account the differences in costs across different countries. So how much science realistically can Armenia support with this kind of funding, Areg?
I guess that's a rhetorical question, and my rhetorical answer will be probably not much. I will, however, say that there are some other metrics. So there are some other databases which, for example, track different countries' scientific productivity by looking at the number of papers published and citations to those papers, etc. I don't have that right now with me, but in the past when I looked, Armenia actually was fairly high in the fractional sense. Again, if you look at the fractional per researcher, how many publications were done, Armenia compared quite favorably, at least when compared to Europeans and things like that. So it's interesting that I was going to show a similar type of a plot, much maybe less complicated than the one that you showed. Yours is much more data rich. But essentially, yeah, it shows that Armenia historically has always spent about 0.2% of its gross domestic product for the Armenians speakers out there. GDP is in Armenia, it's ANA, Amahara Nevkin Artyom. Essentially, it's the wealth of the country. So Armenia spends only 0.2% of that every year. And that number has essentially stayed completely flat for last 30 years. So it's interesting what Armenia has been able to achieve despite this small amount of funding. For example, you know, in the 90s at least, Armenia was very active in nuclear physics community, international nuclear physics community. There were big centers that were, you know, particle physics, nuclear physics centers where Armenians had a very big representation always. Okay, and over time that somehow diminished for a variety of reasons. Nowadays, when you talk to people, they say a lot less participation from Armenia. And when you ask why, because in the 90s we were all starving. I mean, 90s were tsurtumut. It was a disaster. 90s was a disaster, and we were better in our research in the 90s than now, where Armenia is not starving anymore. Okay, Armenia still has lots of economic problems, but it's not. These are not question of like, you know, bread lines like we had in the 90s and an inability to heat up apartments. You know, Armenians live a lot more comfortably today. So why did some science suffer, okay, in its productivity over the last 30 years, while Armenia became richer? Okay, and I don't have a short answer to that. I have hunches and I have suspicions, and I can share them while telling you to take it with a grain of salt. But I think the general issue, I suspect, is essentially the main problem that I see in Armenia. It seems that there is just a lack of vision in terms of from the leadership of the country about both this one, previous one, and the one before that, about where it is that science needs to go. Essentially, science is sort of treated as something that we do by inertia. We have some science, we should not let it die, but we're not going to really do anything for it to improve much either. You know, so we have the current situation that we do.
Right. Right. It's interesting you mentioned physics. I also looked at one point, and it seems like most of the, you know, if you look at like metrics like publications and citations, most of it coming out of Armenia is in physics. It seems there is a very, you know, and this seems to be like one of the positive legacies of Soviet times, I guess. And I wonder if the diminishing that you are seeing is kind of gradual, you know, we'll lose people over time, we'll lose, you know, some of the same infrastructure that, you know, we had in, you know, Soviet Union built basically in Armenia. And then over time, it becomes less and less productive in a way.
You know, it's in this conversation is precisely where we should bring in researchers from Armenia and exactly ask them those questions. I can sort of relate to what people told me, right. But again, those are essentially snapshots from like individuals, are anecdotal kind of evidence. The main issue that that people complain about is that the quality of the students from the universities has, at least in physics, has diminished significantly. I also, before continuing, I do want to say that the reason I speak about physics is because I'm a physicist myself. I know about physics more. I don't want to claim that physics is the thing and that's all, you know, of course we have like the humanities, like there's quite good research being done in biology. I just don't know about it as much, and I cannot talk competently about it. Not that what I'm talking about is that knowledgeable, because I'm outside of Armenia and we're describing what is happening inside Armenia, right? But to go back to the question as to what has been happening, the complaint I've heard is that just in general the quality of the education has diminished, and specifically in the words of one researcher, when the students graduate and come into graduate school, when they are doing their PhD, when they actually do their research, they basically, at the institute, they have to teach them basic physics that they should have learned as part of their undergraduate. Okay. So you know, we have talked extensively. Maybe I'm taking conversation in the wrong direction.
No, that's fine.
If you interrupt me, Armenian. But you know, this is where science and education really need to be together. Historically, in Soviet Union, and this seems to be also the general model in some European countries as well. You know, you have educational institutions like Yerevan State University, Department of Physics, right? And then you have institutes doing research. And typically, you have people who don't do much teaching, all they do is research, and then people who all they do is teaching and don't do much research, right? And there are some people who do both. Right. In the United States, there are physicists as well who only do teaching and physicists who only do research, but they are a small minority. Most physicists, I would say, at least half of them are doing both. Okay, and it's really important for science research and science education to be really done together. In other words, if you are like, I'm going to give the most intuitive reason, but maybe not the most important reason. If you need researchers, if you need graduate students for your research group, well, you should teach them. Okay, right. You should go and you should make sure that those graduate students, before they become graduate students, they learn good physics. Okay, so that means you personally going and teaching to them. Why that is not happening? People have been saying about this since pretty much Armenian independence, that the Soviet model is essentially condemned, that we need to sort of. It's not happening. It's not happening for a variety of reasons. I suspect that it's not happening primarily because of administrative reasons, but also for a variety of political reasons. For example, if a researcher goes to Yerevan State University, starts teaching there, what happens at the teachers, the lecturers in Yerevan State University are paid hourly, meaning they are paid based on the number of the the courses they teach. If someone else comes and starts co-teaching, that lecturer is going to have their already small salary cut in half or something, reduced, because now they'll be saying, well, you're teaching less hours. So the existing system of incentives is such that it disincentivizes participation of outside researchers in the educational process, and it needs to be changed. The reason that the lecturers are not inviting researchers to come participate in the teaching is not because they're evil or because they don't understand. No, they don't do it, it seems, because of very clear economic reasons. Okay, and those economic reasons need to be changed if this were to be changed.
Right. So it seems to me clear that participation of researchers in the education process should be good for education. Because people who are active, who actually do things, they can teach the students more current stuff, more cutting-edge stuff, and prepare them better for future work in research. Is it also better for science? I mean, that part may not be 100% clear. I don't know what the answer is.
So there is in physics at least well, in science I think you will hear this people say a lot, that you actually understand physics when you start teaching it. Right. And I cannot agree with it more. Like, you think you know physics, you think you know the topic at hand, and then now you're trying to teach it to people who have no clue, right? And then suddenly when you're teaching it, when they start asking you naive questions, you suddenly realize that lots of things that you thought were obvious are actually not obvious at all. Then you go home and you start scratching your head and you realize there's huge gaps in your own knowledge as a lecturer. And that really forces, especially when you're dealing with smart students who are going to see those gaps and are going to point it out, and it's going to be embarrassing during the lecture if you cannot answer them. So it really puts pressure on you as a scientist to really go clean up your act, so to speak, and really have a very good understanding of what is happening. I find that teaching, the process of teaching itself, is extremely valuable. It's extremely valuable for you to just understand the topic at hand. It is a way for you to raise the next generation of scientists who will come and do this research with you, okay? And I would say that it also improves your ability to communicate and to explain, which is critical for collaborative work that takes place most of the time in a scientific research environment.
Right. Would you also say, since you worked also, you worked at Los Alamos and now you are at MIT, so these are kind of those two different environments. Is there also any difference in the environment that that is relevant for this or no?
For I guess for the participants who are not familiar with the just general structure of the scientific research in the United States, the United States is a big country, but I guess what Armenia is raising, a lot of research is done in the universities in the United States. So we're called research universities, right? If you look at the big famous universities, all of them do research, and they're primarily famous for their research, right? However, a lot of the research is done in the private sphere, and most importantly, it's being done in something called national labs, Azgain Laboratoriane. So I think the one way to think of a national lab, think about the Yerevan Physics Institute, think of Mergelian Institute, except that national labs are much more broad. Yerevan Physics Institute is historically used to do only physics. Now it is called Azgain Laboratoria. National laboratory is being changed into a national lab. The national labs in the United States they were more mission driven rather than discipline driven, okay? So for example, the big national laboratories like Los Alamos, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, Oak Ridge National Laboratory, their original goal was to make nuclear bombs. That was the #1 priority for creating those national laboratories, okay? For the development of nuclear weapons, Los Alamos is most famous or infamous for the creation of nuclear weapons. However, the way things happened is that these laboratories also start engaged in just pure science, okay? Physics, computer science, material science, chemistry, even biology, even though biology has nothing to do with nuclear weapons, experimental theoretical physics, mathematics, computation, variety of disciplines. And the reason behind this is because many of the disciplines I at least are related to the technologies necessary for nuclear weapons, but also because the administrators in the 40s understood that if you are to entice the best scientists to come and work on a nuclear program, you also need to give them opportunity to do the best science. The best scientists will require the ability to do the best science. If you tell them that you are only going to work on a nuclear bomb, they will never come, okay? So for that reason, the national labs also became these big hubs of scientific activity where people were working on basic science, pure science. So in terms of the way national labs work, in terms of the way academia works, is in academia, if you will believe the academics, so academics in English does not mean academicos, it means faculty, okay? It means lecturers like myself, okay? If you ask us, the most common answer will be that about the difference is that in academia, meaning in the universities, you have more freedoms in general. And that is generally speaking is true. You can pick and choose what you want to do your research in, okay? And for, let's say, if your research is related to politics, for example, if you are a political scientist, okay, or if you are a historian, where suddenly all kinds of issues may come up, universities sort of shield you from any kind of political repercussions. So this allows you to do research with a full independence. It allows you to seek the truth with a full, I mean, maybe not 100%, but the greatest, I think I would say greatest possible independence from political pressures, from some kind of administrative pressures, etc., etc., etc. In the national labs, you have less of that freedom. In the national labs, there is a specific mission, and you're supposed to be working towards that mission.
Interesting. All right, let me relate it to that. I want to go back to that same diagram. It kind of illustrates the points you made. So if I click on, say, United States, right, it shows, it shows that, United States spends close to $500 billion per year on research and development. Now, more than 70% of that is research and development done by business enterprises. The second biggest is universities, like you mentioned. So it's about 62 billion. The third is the government, which is 54 billion. I guess that includes, Los Alamos and maybe National Science Foundation and things like that. And then there are private nonprofit foundations, which spend about 20 billion. All right. And this is kind of not unusual. If we look at other countries, If we look at Germany, it kind of looks similar: business, universities, government. If we look at smaller countries like Sweden, business is the biggest, second universities, third government. Um, in Asia, Japan, business, universities, government. Singapore, business, universities, and government. Now, if we go back to Armenia, it's pretty much all government. There is a little bit of universities, but my guess is this is the money that the government gives universities, and then they spend it.
Yeah, yeah.
So I wonder if this structure where you have business-funded research, you have universities, independent research, then you have government, maybe somewhat more directed. This structure somehow is because many countries, many developed economies seem to have this type of situation, and we don't. And I wonder whether this kind of structure where you have all these different components is actually really, kind of like an optimal way of doing it. And what kind of, for example, business, what kind of science what kind of research do they sort of fund? It's also possible it's different, right?
Yeah, yeah. So I think the question to ask is, well, what do we mean by research and development, right?
Right.
And then we can sort of understand, well, why is the business such a big participant in research and development? So research development does not, doing physics experiments is very, very small fraction of what we call research and development. So research means basic research, such as going and discovering new phenomena or discovering new stars and whatnot. Applied research, such as from the science that you have learned, find if there is interesting ways in which you can apply that science to a particular type of a societal, industrial, economic problem. Okay, that is research. Okay, that also means development of concepts. Okay, that's what I work a lot in. And then there's development. Okay, development means actually like engineering in the classical sense of the word, where you are taking all kinds of sensors that have been developed, okay, different materials that have developed, that have been sort of, produced, and then you assemble them into an F-22 fighter jet, stealth fighter jet, okay? Right. The engineering that goes into the fighter jet, okay, is itself also part of the development, okay? Development of a new electric vehicle, okay, is part of the research that goes into this development, into making this car, okay, is also development, okay? Going and assembling the car is not development, but actually coming up with the prototype and doing, for example, doing hydrodynamic simulations to understand its resistance to the wind and whatnot, that is development, okay? So R&D is much bigger than doing pure science. And now that we understand what is development, it becomes clear as why business is the leading participant in this breakdown, okay? Because a lot of the development is done in the private sector, okay? Mm-hmm. The examples I gave you are those. So then, okay, now if we sort of understand what is research and development and why business is so well represented in countries, in industrial kind of first world countries, then the question is, well, why is it so small in Armenia? Right. And that, in a way, that is troublesome, right? To me, it's troublesome that we don't see this last part, that we essentially have industry, and then we have science, and there's nothing seems to be happening in between, okay? So yeah, I think it's something that one needs to dig deeper and understand.
Right. Going back to sort of universities, you talked about it, and I agree. You kind of mentioned it that the reason universities, that structure where universities are not particularly places of research in Armenia and also other former Soviet countries is a legacy of Soviet Union, and to some extent I think it's because universities weren't a place where Soviet Union wanted students to develop critical thinking or something along those lines, but more of an indoctrination kind of place where you come, they give you ready answers, you need to accept those answers, and you cannot question them. And this is kind of a bigger problem. And I think to some extent, I cannot say for sure, but to some extent that tradition continues in Armenia. And like you mentioned that the students who are coming out of universities are not as good as they used to be. Now I don't know why that happened over time, but part of the reason they may not be as good is maybe that. In other words, the educational institutions are not teaching students to think critically, and instead they're just getting these ready kind of answers, and they need to memorize them, and that's the way of learning.
Yeah, so I think there's, I guess, three different topics, important topics that you're bringing up. In terms of the research in the academic institutions, it's not that there is no research is being done in academic institutions. For example, my aunt Alita Danagoulian, anyone who has graduated from Yerevan Yerevan State University's Department of Physics knows my aunt. So people, when they run into me, they're like, Danagoulian, do you know Alita? I'm like, yeah, she's my aunt. She's actually in all Danagoulian clan, if you will. She was the first one who got into not just physics, but into nuclear physics. Then my father sort of followed. I mean, she was sort of like a big inspiration to many of us. So she is doing research. It's not that the research is not being done in academia. It's just that it's not being done. It's not seen as essentially indispensable part of the academic of the daily activities in the universities. Okay, there are research groups in Yerevan State Universities, but nowhere near the same same volume of research is being done in the universities in Armenia as it is, let's say, in the United States. So that is one clarification. Let's say you were asking about, I already forgot. You mentioned about critical thinking, right? No, I mean, that is a big topic, and it's a little bit maybe outside of what we're discussing, but it's an extremely important one. So where do people learn critical thinking, right? I have all too often run into physicists and mathematicians who are amazing in their work, but the moment we start discussing society and politics, like they start producing like demagoguery of level God. Okay, and it's like, how can a person who is has such a sharp mind when it comes to mathematics and physics becomes completely not equipped to have a systematic, structured, critical kind of thinking when it comes to the non-precise kind of topics like politics, society. And I think the main reason is the way education is organized in Armenia. There's two problems. One of them is that the way we teach history and the way we teach social sciences in Armenia, okay? And in fact, the way we don't teach those, as you know, as of a year ago, I think essentially physicists and mathematicians are not required to learn any history and Armenian at the university, which I think is on one hand, I want to say it's a disaster. I mean, come on, scientists has to know about our society, okay? I can tell like a very interesting anecdote about MIT. But on the other hand, knowing how it's being taught, maybe it's not such a big loss after all. Two anecdotes that I want to tell about how important are the humanities for one's development of critical thinking. I'll tell a story that, two stories I'll tell. One of them was when I came to this country. I came when I was a 16-year-old kid. I graduated from my school, from Yerevan's physical mathematical school, Fizmat the Pros. I came to this country and I went to high school again because of age differences. Here, kids were graduating later in Armenia. They forced me to go to high school. And this was some average, mediocre high school, okay? It was not some special high school. And one of my surprises, I'm really glad I ended up doing it because it allowed me to do an apple-to-apple comparison to also how we teach in Armenia at the Michnakar K-12 level and how we teach K-12 in America. And I was amazed how history and literature are taught in America, okay? Back in Armenia, I used to think of literature as you read Charens, you read Bakuns, and then you read some critique, literary critique piece, which is like just inane, boring crap written in a book. And then you write an essay, Shara Drutsun, okay, repeating the same things, and God forbid you step one step away from that thing, the teacher yells at you. And I came to here, and my teacher of English, first of all, she like read my first composition, my essay, and she said that you don't know how to write an essay. Oh my God, we need to teach you how to write an essay before you go to university. This is shameful. And I said, what do you mean? So here, the way literature is taught is that you read something, okay? You develop your own conclusions, okay? You develop your own thesis, you defend it in an essay, you argue, okay? You bring logical constructs to substantiate your claims and things like that. And I found out that literature, surprise, can be a very intellectually challenging kind of topic. Unlike what I thought of it before as this boring topic that nobody, just a repetition essentially. So in literature, later when I went to university, as a physicist, one of the courses that I enjoyed the most was, again, a class in English where we're, for example, learning about fallacies, like logical fallacies. Like, I don't even know what is the word for logical fallacy in Armenian. We never learn about it. And you know why? And when you read any kind of a forum discussion anywhere, Facebook, Reddit, it's like every second word is some kind of a logical fallacy, and most people don't realize, okay? They don't realize that there is this, logical fallacies, for those people who maybe are not familiar with it, essentially, is various kind of like demagogical tricks that you use in your arguments, which are easily debunked, but are extremely common. For example, attacking your opponent, doing logical sequences that do not follow from each other, etc. And there's a whole field that in the humanities that studies just those because they're so common. When you learn about them, you learn how to recognize those both in other people's arguments as well as in your own arguments, so that improves your argumentation. Okay, and that also helps your scientific work, because in scientific work also you need to make sure that there is a logical sequence between everything. That is not taught in Armenia. It is definitely not taught to the scientists. And if you want to develop, the purpose of education is not to just produce good specialists, it's to produce good thinkers, okay, who will change the future of their society. The second anecdote I want to tell that's related to this, MIT, which is known for its work in science and technology, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, right? It's like really technology, right? It has a School of Humanities, okay? And the School of Humanities was founded after World War II. And if you guess why MIT before World War II did not have a School of Humanities. School of Humanities includes in itself history, political science, different kind of social sciences, literature, music. Okay, so before World War II, MIT didn't have that. MIT was like all physics, mathematics, engineering, nothing else, because that's what we need. After World War II, they created this School of Humanities. The main reason, if you will, motivator for that was a nuclear bomb. Essentially, scientists felt that second time in a row, scientists are producing this enormous evil, okay? First chemical weapons and now nuclear weapons. And they concluded that the reason that they are doing this is because scientists are growing detached from the society around them. They're developing some kind of they make this invention, like the bomb, okay, nuclear bomb, without thinking about its impact about society, because they don't think about society. They have not been taught to think about the society, okay? And that was one of the motivations why MIT created this School of the Humanities. So the critical thinking is extremely important, and I don't feel that it's being really taught. It's being taken seriously in Armenian education even up to now.
Right. All right. Let me sort of circle back a little to the funding question. There's a question about the amount of money, but there is also kind of allocation question, right? And especially when the money comes from the government, there's a question, whether how well the government can allocate, the government of Armenia, but also other governments. So I wonder how there's funding from government of United States, right? But and maybe you have gotten some of that funding for your own research. So how's the process of that? Is it politicians decide whether you get funding? Is it bureaucrats who decide whether you get funding? Who decides and how?
So I guess you're asking about the United States.
Right.
Yeah. So that's a good question. Ultimately, it's the politicians have to sign off on a particular budget, right, a bill, for the funding to end up in my research kind of account for me to be able to use it. So but how do we get from the politician signing off to me getting it? What's the chain, and who's making these decisions, right? So that it's not a politician who decides what kind of research you should do, but it's the there's a scientific kind of thinking behind what is worth doing and what is not worth doing. So the way science is administered, scientific funding, I guess, is administered in the United States. In essence, there is no such a thing as Ministry of Education or Science. It doesn't exist. Instead, there are ministries or departments in American parlance, okay, that essentially incorporate in them some of that functionality. So one of the biggest ones that does this is Department of Energy, which does a lot more than energy. It was originally founded in the 20s when there was a big need for electricity, and it was primarily responsible for the hydroelectric power plants. But then its scope expanded dramatically, okay? Other agencies that fund research and development and research in academia, in the universities, is Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security. Each one of them has essentially funding agencies embedded inside itself that do this thing. And then there is freestanding organizations like National Science Foundation, like National Institute of Health, who all of them are responsible for determining the direction of research and funding it. Now, how is the key question that I'm coming to, that what you asked is, how is determination done? What research to fund? I would say that it's done in combination between, let's say, politicians as well as scientists. So, for example, if you have national science foundations, okay, its administration consists of scientists. Okay, they could be physicists, there could be mathematicians, there could be biologists. National Science Foundation funds all kinds of research. Okay, chemists. Okay, who at some point were researchers, but at some point decided that they want to do some kind of more science policy, science administration. And then they were hired to these positions. Universities typically give them some kind of a couple of years where they can go and just do that full time, because the universities understand that it's important to administer the process in which science funding is being done. And they create committees that meet together and decide, for example, in chemistry, there will be a committee that sort of decides which areas of chemistry need funding, or how that funding should be changed. It's not like they shut off funding here and turn on the funding here by 200%. Typically, there's already established funding kind of profile, okay? And then they sort of might increase something by some 5-10%, decrease something by 5-10%. Typically, that's the extent at which it's being done, because if you do it more drastically, you're going to, you may destroy a whole area that will not come back later. So that is as far as research in academia is concerned. Then there's a research in the national labs, okay? And the national labs, that's primarily administered national laboratories. So the equivalent of, for example, Yerevan Physics Institute in the United States, Los Alamos, let's say, or Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Most of the funding of those laboratories, especially operating costs of these laboratories, which is enormous. Let's say one national lab might cost $2 billion a year just to operate, okay? Without all the additional funding that comes for research. That is done by Department of Energy, which has similar kind of committees and similar individual leadership, which are sometimes it's a combination of politicians against scientists, typically from those national labs, okay, that are making some of these decisions. So scientists absolutely need to play a key role in science policy, in research policy. How much of that is being done in Armenia? I know that there is, that there is Itakan Committee, which is an independent organization, and it is populated by scientists. How this kind of details are being managed in Armenia, that I don't have as much of an understanding.
All right. Another thing you mentioned about preparation of scientists by the universities. I wonder what your view is on Armenian young men and women going to study abroad, including doing PhDs. What does that have a chance to play any role in the future of all these things in Armenia?
Yeah, so that's an very interesting topic that you're raising. So as you know, over the last 10 years, at least until 2 years ago, I know what happened since the last 2 years. There was this Louis Himnadram, right? Louis Foundation, which essentially funded a study of Armenian students in what they decided were top 10 universities in the world. How they decided the top 10? They took a US news report, chose the top 10 and said, that's it. This is where you are going. I mean, like, how do you rank universities? Like, I have no idea, but they had to start from somewhere and they didn't bother asking for advice from anyone, as it is being done in Armenia. So they chose a top 10. Nevertheless, that's what they decided. They brought in significant amount of funding. So the main, I think, leader of this program was Serge Sargsyan, and then Vigen Sargsyan, who was the Minister of Defense later, and a number of other people. They had this system where they would fund, pay for half the students, covers half students' tuition. The student had to go and find the other half. Very inefficient, very poorly thought out, but nevertheless, large number of very, very good Armenian students came studying in some of the best universities. Okay. Now, the goal of the Louis Foundation was the students to study in Armenia and then eventually come back to Armenia and serve Armenia, right? And guess what happened? Very few of them, small fraction of them came back to Armenia. Most of them stayed in America, in Europe. So basically what happened is that Armenian resources were used to fund the future of American and European science. It's a great idea, isn't it? Right? Why should, like, let's spend Armenia's meager resources to fund the future of American and European science. And the reason this happens because it was, again, very poorly thought out. And they didn't think of ways to incentivize the students to come back to Armenia after they had completed their studies. You can never, I mean, like, you cannot sort of get someone to sign their life away and say that they will come back, but you can incentivize them to come back. And if like half of them come back, or maybe 70% of them come back, that would be a great outcome. Instead, the numbers, from what I understand, maybe 20% of them came back. So, okay, so how would you incentivize them to come back? Something that was not done. By the way, as an example to that, I was an undergraduate student at MIT in the 90s, and MIT was just overrun by students from Turkey, right? Turkey has a very ambitious, similar type of Louis program, much bigger, much more funding, and much better thought out. The general requirement is that if we fund you to go and study in America or in Europe, then you have to come back to Turkey and work for 5 years in one of the institutions over here. And they will create jobs for the students to come and work 5 years. And after that 5 years, they can go back to America if they want to. But they need to come back and work for 5 years and bring back some of their knowledge to Turkey, which is a very good, and I would say very obvious idea. I don't, you know, we didn't do that. We didn't even try that obvious part of this thing, right? So many of the students are now working in the United States, in Europe. They really do care about Armenia, but they're not gonna abandon their very promising career paths in the West to come to Armenia and to do nothing. And I'm saying this, you know, I'm accentuating this because I hear this very often. Why don't you come to Armenia and save Armenia? And I tell people, okay, I come and land in Zvartnots. What's the next thing I'm going to do? What am I going to do? Create a new institute? I'm gonna reform the educational system on my own. Okay, for that to happen, there needs to be involvement and commitment by the Armenian government. Education and science are not like private business where you can take your business, bring it to Armenia, where you can start a startup in Armenia. Okay, you know, if you were a doctor, medical doctor, you could create a clinic in Armenia. In fact, many diaspora Armenians have done that. But in science education, I'm sorry, it just doesn't work that way. Okay, I keep hearing people saying, "Come and you know, help Armenia." Exactly how do you want me to help Armenia? Tell me the mechanism, okay, by which I would be able to help Armenia. In reality, I have ideas of how I could help to Armenia without actually physically abandoning everything here and moving to Armenia. There are some intermediate solutions. But the whole point is that we need to sort of incentivize the students, okay, to come back to Armenia and help Armenia meaningfully, okay? And just telling them, this is your patriotic duty to do it, I'm sorry, it's just not gonna happen, okay? Save your breath on patriotic speeches. However, what will work is if you, for example, create, let's say, faculty positions, okay, in the universities in Armenia. And if you have physicists who have graduated from Harvard, from Stanford, from big universities that are doing amazing research, try to incentivize them to come and to teach, maybe not full time, maybe over summer, okay? Maybe they can come and do their sabbaticals, okay? Maybe you can create some incentives, and I'm talking about the real incentives, not speeches, okay? Enough with speeches, okay, people.
Right.
That will, for example, encourage them to have collaborations with their colleagues in Armenia, to mentor students in Armenia, okay? These are like intermediate solutions that do not involve, you know, like just a total move to Armenia, which is very risky and ultimately probably not a productive thing to do, okay? So I think going forward, what the Armenian government could do, if it wanted to, okay, is try to involve more of this, for example, former Louis scholars. They're called Louis scholars, and it's very important to continue that program, but continue it in a more efficient, effective way. Okay, I know that after the Louis program was shut down, this Huis program, okay, was created. That rhymes, Huis, Louis. I think the next one will be called Huis. You know, I don't know what there was a fairly ambitious program. What came out of it, I don't know. Maybe something interesting was done, but I don't know if anything. It was led by, I think the program was kind of led by Anna Hagopian. She came to MIT. She talked to us about this. I don't know where it stands currently.
All right. No, I think you are right, and some of it is, you know, the financial part. You know, people making it difficult for people to go back to Armenia. Some of it is the difference in, you know, that is financial, but a lot of it is other, because people know that if you go there, you're basically putting an end to your career in some sense. It's like there is no room to grow for many people in many fields, and that's even more important for these people, and that's what prevents them from, you know, going back on a full-time basis. But like you said, this part-time, the idea of this some sort of part-time and you know, intermediate solutions, I think that's where the real, you know, possibilities are.
Yeah.
You know, just telling people come back and live here when there's nothing they are going to do, and they cannot really contribute at make kind of contributions they are good at. Right.
It would be a waste. I mean, I think what we're touching upon is this like eternal topic of Hayastan and Spurk. How can Spurk participate in helping Hayastan? And like we can go on for another hour talking about it, but very briefly, what I would say is that the problem is that in Armenia, very often we see Spurk as a cash cow. Okay, it's a cow that is going to be milked for cash, for finances, and for resources. Spurk is very rarely seen as a source of advice, of expertise, and something that we don't have in Armenia. Okay, there has been this real for 30 years talking about sort of bringing Spurk and Armenia together, and in fact there has been quite, I would say, you know, Spurk and Armenia have come close together for reasons other than because of what the government does, or what, mostly for other reasons, because, well, today, you know, traveling to Armenia is easier than in the 90s. Communication is easier. Like what I'm doing right now would be unthinkable even 10 years, 15 years ago or something like that. So Spurk has been more integrated into Armenia, but there's so much more to be had that we're not doing. Okay, like one issue that has come up in the past, for example, okay, coming back to Armenia and changing something. I know very specific Spurkahai and Hayastansi Spurk individuals that did come back to Armenia, did try to change things, again, run into a wall of hostility. Not only they were not incentivized, not only there's no incentives, there's actual deterrence from people coming and doing it. Because what happens is that people come back, they try to change, okay, some kind of an institution, some kind of an organization, and guess what? Okay, people don't like change. Humans don't like change in general, and Armenians are humans, and Armenians also, they will talk to tell you that, oh, come and change Armenia, but when you come and try to change Armenia, you run into hostility, in particular from people who are very well established. They already see the organization as their home. They don't want that organization to change. Even if they realize that the organization is dying, they still don't want it to be changed. Okay, they see it as a threat, personal to themselves and to their home institution. You know, in general, changing organizational cultures is extremely difficult everywhere, whether it's in Canada, Armenia, or Zimbabwe. Or like there's an expression in English, you know, culture will eat policy for breakfast. Հայերեն եթե դա թարգմանենք, բանը մշակույթը քո քաղաքական ծրագիրը հում կուտ. Once there is an established culture, you know, if changing it is quite difficult. So when we see that, we see a lack of participation from spurk in many of these reforms, it is not only in part because there is no vision in how to evolve spurk. In many cases, there's a specific, I guess, resistance for people to come and to do that. You know.
Right. All right. Let me read a question that was posted in the chat. Let me see. Okay, so David Akopian wrote, this is most critical issue we need to start with in Armenia to revitalize science and make education more relevant. Where do we need to start? Reforms at academy, higher education, what should they be about? Or more evolutionary, building, cluster research, or education research centers, industry, IT is a good example.
I think, yeah, so I don't have a short answer, and
right.
I don't think there are short answers, because it's a huge system that needs to be reformed. And I think people in Armenia, I think there is a recognition that it needs to change, right? I mean, the education needs to be changed from the first day of the first grade. Like really, there is no, how children, education is about teaching people how to think, how to use their brain, right? By giving them difficult things to do with their brain, right? That's primarily, if you in one sentence, what is education about? It's that. It's not only knowledge, it's ability to use your brain. I think that's even more important than knowledge. Knowledge can be acquired later, but it's kind of like you have an Olympic athlete that needs to start training at age 6, okay? And just like an Olympic athlete treats their muscles, child trains their brain, okay, to solve difficult problems, okay? So where to start this from? Well, I think it needs to happen at many levels. I think to me, education is critical, right? Because education is really the future of everything, right? But how do you change education? You need to change the educators, teachers. How do you change the teachers, okay, who have been doing this for 20, 30 years, okay? They have a particular way of teaching. I brought example of literature, how we teach literature, okay? How do you change that? I don't have an easy answer to that. So we need to change those who are teaching the teachers, okay? So for example, if Manka Varjakan is the one who is producing the most of the teachers in Armenia, how is Manka Varjakan teaching techniques to its future teachers? Perhaps what sort of surprises me is that in Armenia, like different institutions have monopoly on a particular type of a discipline. Manka Varjakan produces teachers, although some, let's say, graduates from Yerevan State University also end up in schools, things like that. But why can't we have multiple programs, okay, so they can compete with each other, okay? Why can't AUA create a program in early child education or education in general, okay, or compete with Manka Varjakan? I mean, in order to have improvement of quality, everything, this is true for whether it's research or whether it's making cups, there needs to be competition, okay? Every participant in the process needs to know that there's someone else competing with them so that they improve their game. If there's no competition, there's no incentive for them to improve their game, okay? So, so we need to do this at multiple different levels, and that needs to be done simultaneously. But the thing is that in order to change things, right, so you need to also understand where the problems are, okay? Like, how do we know which part of the education systems are the biggest gaps, for example? We have limited resources. Where should we send those resources? For that, you need to do some kind of a study. For example, standardized testing is a great way of understanding which schools and in which years of those schools are failing, right? Standard testing is a standard thing, as the term implies. In the United States, every year my children have to take the standardized exams, and I can see where exactly they stand in their school, where exactly they stand in the state. Armenia should do the same thing. There's no reason why Armenia shouldn't do that. I mean, just not to give a completely pessimistic view, let me just share one slide that I really wanted to show you all about standardized testing specifically. Let me see if I can do this. Here we go. Share. Okay, I hope you can see this. So these are there is this standardized test that U.S. State Department doing every 4 years. It's called TIMSS. It's called, I think, Trends in Math and Science something. I forget what is the last S over here. But every 4 years, they'll do this test, and they will essentially give a same exam to a bunch of school children all over the world. Okay, and you can first of all compare how different countries are doing. This is typically done at the 4th grade and 8th grade. Okay, you can compare how two countries are doing, but also you can see how a country is doing over time. So if you look at Armenia, and this is on top, it's a bit counterintuitive. This is the average grade throughout Armenia. Okay, and this is the year. So first of all, there's some good news here. Like we're criticizing what's happening in Armenia, but there is some nuggets of hope. We can see that since 2011, there has been a real improvement in Armenia in both mathematics and in science. There has been like a quite significant, there was a drop in the late 2000s, probably a result of the economic decline in the 90s. Typically, these effects come like 10, 20 years later, right? But then probably the economic growth in the 2000s, expressed itself in the 2000 teens, okay, in this clear improvement in the, improvement is not very big. This is kind of the way we plot it. It looks very dramatic, but it's not very dramatic. We go from 420 to 470, which is noticeable, but not so dramatic. One thing that people should notice, the numbers are broken down by girls and boys. And you can see that the girls in Armenia are systematically outperforming boys in science and in mathematics. Okay, this is a whole big topic as to why we're not incentivizing girls to get involved in the sciences, in the STEM in Armenia. In fact, if anything, there's very overt resistance towards girls getting into science and mathematics. There is this traditional view that girls cannot do science and mathematics. Okay, I'm sorry, that's total bullshit. Okay, people need to get that idiotic idea out of their brains. It's a medieval concept that women cannot do science, and it's poisoning the future of Armenia. Women make up 50% of Armenia's resources. So by not engaging them into the sciences, we're throwing away half of our resources, okay? That's absolutely criminal. And that is being done on a personal level, not at the government level, but individual personal level, because we are holding on to these antiquated patriarchal, rusty ideas of who can do what, okay? Women are great at doing sciences. There is data to prove this, okay? And we really need to reform the way we think about women, women in the sciences, and not only in sciences, in many disciplines of scholarly work, okay? So there has been, this kind of growth. However, despite this progress, and this is a real progress, Armenia is still, lagging behind the world, okay? So the world average is about 500. Armenia, specifically in math, is right below 500, so it's like fairly average, okay? This is where Azerbaijan is. Azerbaijan is 515. Azeris are better than us in mathematics. Yes, that's another stereotype that we like to hold on, that we somehow are smarter than Azeris. Total nonsense. Azeris can, as we found out in the last war, they can be very smart, sometimes can be much smarter than us, okay? This is where the United States is, okay, 538, and this is where Russia is. Russia is really doing extremely well. Russia was doing the same plots I don't have for Russia. Russia was doing very poorly in the 90s, but Russia has really pulled ahead of everyone, has really funded, has put lots of funding in their education and science, and Russia has really gotten ahead. This is where Korea is. Korea is like one of the, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Korea are ahead of everyone. So Armenia, if it wants to compete with the world, it needs to go from somewhere over here to some kind of a much more advanced position. Anyway, but I'll let you move on to the next questions. I realize our time is very limited.
Right, but I wanted actually to go back to something you said about the competition. And that's, I think it feels like it's also kind of Soviet legacy where everything was, predetermined, that you go study in, Yerevan State, you go study in Polytech, you go study, and then your career path was also predetermined. And there was, clear, there was no need for competition because the government knew the best. But, one way to improve things, as you said, in Armenia, is to encourage competition, including maybe new forms of doing education. Like, we know there is in sort of secondary education, there is this IB school, for example. Mm-hmm. In higher education, there are kind of new universities like AUA, for example. There's French University, there's Slavonic, who may try there, and in many ways, because of the resistance you described earlier, not only to to new things, right? in many ways, sometimes it's easier to create something new than to reform what you have. But at the same time, the government has to be sort of open to these things and to these new experiments in a way of doing education in somewhat different way, which is not 100% controlled by the Ministry of Education. And I'm not sure that Armenian governments kind of have that, but maybe this is kind of one direction to kind of try to push that.
I mean, the problem with the Armenian government, it's somehow, like Armenia has lots of very bright people, like extremely bright people. However, the way Armenian politics works is that it's not the bright people that get to the top of the, of the administrative ladder. It's the leadership. It does not involve in itself too many bright people, and there's something perverse about how, the Armenian government is not a meritocracy. That's one of our big problems. But to going back to your question about there's multiple very good schools and very good institutions, educational institutions, let's just say, who are doing great work. So, for example, IB school is great, right? The Fizmat school that I went to, at some point every year we had at least one student coming to MIT, every other year, and going to big universities. So clearly Fizmat is doing very well too, right? But Armenia has 500,000 students in their K-12 system, in their Mishnah-Kark system, right? And we're talking here about like 1,000 students at most. If you take IB, if you take Kvant, Varjaran, if you take Fizmat and a couple of other kind of, elite, quote unquote, schools, maybe we're talking about like 1,000, 2,000. And, as they say, as the Armenian expression goes, Mitzachkov garun chiga. Ասենք կսկասեի 1000 ծաղկով էլ գարուն չի գա, պետք է գոնե մի 100,000 ծաղիկ լինի, որպեսզի գարուն գա. For those who don't speak Armenian, there's an Armenian expression that the spring will not come with just one flower, right? In this case, even 1,000 flowers are not enough for spring to come. You need like hundreds of thousands of flowers for spring to come. And right now, the seeds of those flowers are frozen in the ground. Okay, and we need to warm up those grounds for these seeds to germinate. So, question is, can we take, for example, the Fizmat's IB schools example and somehow use it as a model for the rest for the rest of the Armenian K-12 educational system? Can we do that? Can we use some of what AUA is doing and use that for other universities like Yerevan State University? And again, just like you said, changing institutions is not easy. I had a conversation with one of the presidents of AUA who was telling me the history of how AUA was founded. And in the early 90s, there was a thought that maybe we should just take Yerevan State University and invest our efforts there. And then the wise decision was that it's probably better to just start from scratch. And AUA is a result of that. That's probably was a wiser thing to do. Changing organizations is difficult, and especially organizations of such a big scale as the whole educational system, which is why there needs to be kind of concerted effort, and it has to be done through the government. In the government, we need people who have vision, who beyond understanding that there's a problem, also are willing to engage others, okay, to formulate a path forward.
Let me read another question. So this is from Svetlana Rutyunyan. Education and science improvement does not happen as a goal in itself. Education and science should be in demand. There is no demand. There will be no progress. Armenia has not defined what progress means for it. It takes the question in a plane of a big politics.
Yeah. So, by the way, I want to introduce Svetlana Rutyunyan. She's my mother. She was instrumental in my my love, in me developing love for mathematics and for the sciences. Okay. So I think the question that she's asking is specifically, what is is there a sense of urgency in Armenia to maybe reformulate about the need for science and education? And this is important in that for like last 30 years, people have been complaining that, oh, science education in Armenia are terrible, but it's wanting to complain about something like, oh, our flowers are wilting away. Well, it's another thing to understand that this is not a luxury. Science and education are not luxury, okay? These are critical things for the future, okay? If you don't want to become some kind of a fourth world country, okay, and if you want to compete with the world and become better, and if you don't become better, people will leave your country. Okay, So it's a question of survival for your country to be competitive with the world. To be competitive with the world in today's economy means being scientifically and technologically progressive. Okay, you're not scientifically, technologically progressive, your economy will fall back, people will leave your country, artagach, that will be end of Armenia. Okay, so science education are not a luxury. It's not flower pots on the decorating your windows. It's a question of survival for the country. I sense that today that urgency, people, average common person on the street has that sense of urgency. Unfortunately, it took a war for this to happen. Unfortunately, it took a devastating defeat for this to happen. We really saw how technological advanced military essentially, defeated a military that we spent 26 years, okay, curating and developing and arming and training, okay, and turned out that technological progress, some mere 20 strike UAVs destroyed, were the cause of half of our losses, more than half of our losses. Half of our losses in armor, artillery units, transportation, and also and just human losses are attributed to primarily to the Bayraktar TB2 strike UAVs and to the Harop Israeli Harop loitering munitions. So, and those are a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the Azeri arsenal, but they are the most advanced ones. Okay, so that tiny arsenal was essentially predetermined. Avoiding half of those losses might mean winning the war. Okay, but because of what happened, because we're totally unprepared, and then the whole question is that not only we were unprepared because we didn't have the technological capacity, we also didn't have the intellectual capacity. The very fact that we let this happen, and despite people warning the leadership of the country, okay, leadership of the military, that this is a major risk to you, okay, there have been documented warnings to the leadership of the army, of the Ministry of Defense, that these strike UAVs are going to be decisive in the future conflict with Azerbaijan. That was completely ignored, and we just walked into the conflict totally unprepared. Okay, we could have, if anything, we could have just looked at the experience of the Syrian forces in the spring of 2020. Okay, where in 1 month the Turks, using the TB2s, caused 300 tanks, destroyed 300 Syrian tanks. Okay, that itself should have made it very clear as the capability of these tanks, right? But our military was not interested in these things. There's famous interviews by the leadership saying that drones are not anything useful. So there was a failure on the technological level, and there's a failure on the intellectual level, and these two things are, of course, connected with each other.
Right.
And I think it's very clear to most people now.
Here's another question from Aram Grigorian. My quick analysis shows that we all like to say we should. Petke. It's the most used word in all headlines in Armenian media. My question is, who should do it, or how to initiate the change? Yeah.
So I think we talked about that too, right? We said that this is not that can be done with like onesies, twosies. This is not that can be done one thing at a time. There has to be a systemic approach. I think the government, when it comes to the educational sector, the government, has to organize this effort. We can create another schools like IB here and there, but again, we're talking about 500,000 students. Okay, one school at a time is not going to fix this problem. So this has to be done through, I'm avoiding the word should, I'm using the word has, to be done through the government structures, but it also means bringing people to the government that sort of understand the importance of the things and have a vision. So ultimately, who is going to do this? It's the Armenian voter is going to do this. If the Armenian voters keep bringing it to the government people that don't care, nothing will change. If the Armenian voters understand the importance of this and demand from their representatives answer to this question, something I said in one of my articles, okay, and really hold their feet to fire on these things, to the point where the political leadership understands that their future depends on solving this problem, then there will be change.
One more question from Samuel Danagoulian. In order to improve teaching and research, and those must be wanted by local people, science must be competitive in terms of salaries, privileges, etc. For instance, the incentive to go to nuclear physics in Yerevan Physics Institute, maybe, were to get involved in research conducted outside, like Jefferson Lab, CERN, and other places. Unfortunately, those opportunities are also seem to be diminishing. In other words, so you understood the question, I think, right?
Yeah. So Samuel Danagoulian is my father. He was also instrumental in my developing interest in physics, particularly in physics. The question essentially has to do with the fact that how do we incentivize students to come and work in physics, or in particular discipline of science, not just physics. We keep talking about physics because we are physicists.
Right. It's the I mean, it's the same issue in other sciences.
Yeah. So one thing is, of course, salaries, right? If you are paying someone 60,000 dirhams per month, I mean, it's I think very few very talented people would be willing to come and work for 60,000 dirhams when they can go and work in some kind of a startup, like an IT startup, and earn 600,000. Okay, some people will do out of principle or because they love science so much. But if you truly want to bring best and the brightest, you need to make the salaries survivable, so people can survive on them. Okay. So that's one thing. Second thing is the question about collaboration with the external user facilities, external institutions in the United States, in Europe. So I mentioned earlier that in the 90s, I was very active during that horrible time. There was quite a bit of an active participation of Armenian scientists with the number of American institutions, European institutions, CERN, and things like that. A lot of that has gone down I can speculate endlessly about why that happened. I think ultimately it's a question that we should ask, local scientists.
All right, let me ask one last question and we'll wrap it up. So, question from Grigory Artazyan. What is your advice to young generation of high school students who want to get into science?
What advice? Oh man, I could go on for 2 hours talking about what advice was to give. I just want to tell them that science is extremely exciting. It's very interesting. I would say, increasingly, the future of the world, okay, is attached to science. Okay, we are just seeing it around us. Okay, just compare 90s versus now. Okay, economists, this is the most obvious reason as to why someone who's interested in science should persist on going to sciences. This is not the main reason. The main reason, I think, is just science is so amazingly interesting. And we do science not only to make our lives easier and so that we can work less and eat more, although that's a big part of the kind of, the human development, right? Work less and eat more. The main reason why we do science, okay, is because that's what humans are about. What's the main difference between a human and an animal? It's the curiosity. It's wanting to look in the stars and understand what are those little sparkly things in the sky. Okay, what worlds are there out there? Okay, what is the nucleus made up of? How do the proteins fold and unfold inside the cell? Okay, that insatiable curiosity to learn more and more is precisely what makes humans humans and distinguishes us from animals. In Armenian history, okay, in Armenian scholarly history, we have had a lot of that, right? We bring examples of Narikatsi for literature, okay, different Armenian philosophers. We bring example of Shirakatsi, okay, and in general, I would say that curiosity and scholarly pursuit are also a big part of the definition of what it means to be Armenian. So I really hope that you will not be deterred by all these kind of objective problems facing, and you will continue with your, with your passion.
All right, Areg. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for this discussion. Hope to see you again in some other place, some other capacity, some other events.
Hopefully in person next time. Yes.
Right.
All right. Take care. Thank you.
I also wanted to thank everyone, the audience. They came, the questions they asked, and you made this more interesting event.